The Admiral laughed out loud in front of everyone, holding his drink and pointing at the quiet woman in the corner, saying, "Iron Widow? What kind of comic book name is that?" And his voice echoed through the SEAL training hall like a slap, making some of the young recruits chuckle nervously. But the woman didn't move, didn't speak, didn't blink, just stood there with her back straight and hands calmly folded in front of her, while deep inside her chest, the fire that had carried her through hell burned steady and silent, because she had been called many things in her life: soldier, widow, commander, but never a joke, not until now. And even though her face stayed calm, the room around her began to shift as whispers spread through the crowd like wind through dry grass, because someone recognized her name, and someone else remembered a story, and then a young officer near the back finally said it out loud. "Sir." She didn't give herself that call sign, and the air froze, because the silence that followed wasn't just awkward. It was heavy, like the room suddenly remembered who she was, and what she'd done, and that not knowing her wasn't her fault but theirs, because she'd never bragged, never demanded attention, never even wore her medals in public. But the people who served with her remembered, and some of them were in that room, standing still, feeling shame creep up their necks, because she wasn't just another officer. She was Commander Jordan May Archer, a decorated combat rescue leader, and the last survivor of Operation Hollowthorn, a mission that had gone bad so fast that half the names were still classified and most of the details buried. But the story had still gotten out, because it was too big to stay hidden, and it began years ago in a desert no one talks about, when her husband, Captain Donnell Archer, was leading a joint unit that was ambushed, and instead of pulling back like ordered, he stayed behind to hold the line, knowing it would cost him his life. And Jordan, back then just a comms tech, listened to his final message as it came through in bursts of static, begging her not to come for him, to let him go, to live. But she didn't. She packed her kit and joined the next rotation into that valley, not because she wanted revenge, but because she needed to do what he would have done: protect the others. And on her third mission in, she got her chance, when a Black Hawk went down behind enemy lines with 4 survivors, and no one else could reach them because of the terrain and fire zones. So she volunteered and crawled through dust, blood, and nightmares to drag each one out, one by one, over 2 nights without sleep, dodging gunfire, hiding behind rocks, wrapping her own wound with duct tape just to keep going. And when the final man she saved looked up and asked why she came back for him, she said, because he would have. And from that moment, everyone who knew the story called her Iron Widow, not because she was cold, but because she was unbreakable, because she carried loss and still stood, because she walked through fire and never flinched. And now, standing in this bright, clean training hall, years later, with her uniform pressed and her hair tied back, she looked like just another officer, until someone tested her patience, and then the truth showed through. And Admiral Reeves, who had only met her in passing, had no idea what storm he had just stepped into, because one of the SEALs whispered to the man beside him, "She trained Ghost Unit," and another said, "She led the forward evac at Frost Line." And another said, "My cousin owes her his life." And the murmurs turned into movement, heads turning, eyes darting, until even the Admiral started to feel it, the weight of everyone looking not at him anymore, but at her. And that's when she stepped forward, only one step, but enough to make Reeves take a step back, and she looked him straight in the eyes and said softly, "Permission to speak, sir." And the room went still again, because her voice wasn't loud, but it cut clean, and the Admiral nodded without a word, and she said, "I didn't ask for that call sign, sir. Men gave it to me after I carried their brothers through fire." And then she opened her hand and held up a worn piece of cloth, a scorch patch from her husband's last uniform, the one they recovered from the field, burned but still showing part of his name. And she added, "He called me Iron Widow first, because he said I had steel in my soul, and I proved him right." And she tucked the patch back into her coat and stepped back. Nothing dramatic, nothing angry, just truth. And the Admiral looked like he wanted to respond. But before he could, a young cadet, barely 20, trembling, stood up and saluted her, and then another followed, and another, until the entire room stood at attention, even those who didn't know the full story, because now they understood that they had missed something sacred, and as the Admiral slowly lowered his head, someone in the back turned on the screen that showed active personnel commendations. And there it was, her name, 6. Rose Deep, Archer, Jordan M. Awarded Silver Star, Navy Cross, 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses, and the Iron Widow citation, an unofficial but sacred badge given by unanimous vote of survivors from a mission only few returned from. And then the real twist came, because a tall officer walked in, gray hair, sharp eyes, and everyone snapped to attention, because it was Vice Admiral Rowe, who rarely left command, and he said, "I heard there was a ceremony today. Hope I'm not late." And he walked straight to Jordan, shook her hand, and handed her a folded flag, saying, "It took 10 years, but we recovered the rest of his kit. Thought you should have it." And she took it with a hand that barely trembled, even though her eyes glistened. And the Vice Admiral turned to the room and said, "You may laugh at call signs, but don't ever laugh at the legacy behind them." And with that, he looked directly at Reeves, who now stood silent, pale, holding his forgotten drink at his side. And he said, "Son, I suggest you do some reading," and then walked out. And later that day, the Admiral issued a quiet apology. But it didn't matter anymore, because Jordan didn't need his words. She had already earned the respect of those who mattered, and before she left the base, the youngest cadet handed her a hand-carved plaque with her call sign burned into the wood. And underneath, one line carved deep, "She carried the dead and the living, and still walks alone." And that night, a group of recruits gathered and passed around the old stories, and her name became more than legend. It became a goal, something to live up to, not in medals or fame, but in grit, service, and silence. And years later, some of those cadets would become leaders themselves, and when asked who inspired them, they wouldn't say books or movies or loud heroes. They'd say, "Iron Widow," and somewhere far from base, in a quiet town, Jordan Archer would be walking her dog, or planting a tree, or staring at the stars while wearing the ring of the man who believed in her before anyone else did. And when young officers wrote her letters, she'd answer everyone, always ending the same way: "Don't chase glory. Carry someone." Because that's what she did, not just once, but her whole life, and even in silence, her story kept marching forward.